皆さん、こんにちは. Here are the 7 facts that I wish I'd known before I started learning Japanese and what you can do in order to get better at Japanese. 私たち日本語を勉強します。俺と俺の妻。日本語は本当に面白い。しかし、日本語がとっても難しいです。わかりますか? First thing that I wish I'd known about Japanese before I started to learn it is that Japanese is highly contextual. And what I mean by that is you can have the same set of words, but depending on the situation, they'll mean something completely different. And in that way, the contextuality of Japanese is kind of pithy to a fault. It's almost like you don't have the context, and if you don't know a lot of detailed stuff about what's going on in the language, it'll be even harder to understand. And as a writer, a screenwriter, and someone who focuses on the specificity of the language that I use when I'm writing in English, it's real difficult for me to get a hold of this type of language where in Japanese they try to leave as much stuff out as possible. Now, I'm not saying you can't overcome that, I'm just saying that's an aspect of the language I didn't really know a lot about before I started. Another thing that some people talk about, but not everybody talks about, which you may have heard about, is the pitch accent. So even though Japanese is not a tonal language like Mandarin or Cantonese, it does still have pitch accent, which is kind of like emphasis in English language, how we emphasize certain syllables, but it's not the same thing. That's just a comparison. It's not the same. So if you want to know more about pitch accent, definitely don't ask me. Okay, you need to go ask this guy. Check out his channel. As I said at the beginning, Japanese is just so hard. And I knew it was going to be hard. That's the third thing, which obviously if you haven't already started, you probably figured out by now Japanese is hard, but I want to explain more about what that means. Japanese is one of the top 4 or 5 most difficult languages for native English speakers to learn. And so I thought that Japanese would be easier since I already knew a little bit, and it definitely had seemed easier than the little bit of Mandarin that I learned at grad school with my friends from China. So I was like, oh, well, Chinese is so hard, but Japanese must not be nearly that bad. I already know some phrases. It's not going to be that hard. But the more I learned about it, the more I realized why it's kind of put into that category. And so the implication, and the reason why I share this with you, is because this means, especially for me, that progress in Japanese and learning how to read it and speak it is a lot slower than I'm used to with other languages. So if you have watched my channel introduction video where I talk about the languages that I've tried to learn in the past, then you'll know I did some Hebrew, I've done some Spanish. But because those languages are easier, especially the Spanish for a native English speaker, you can kind of make progress with that, and it kind of lends to the motivation that you have while you're learning the language. But with Japanese, because Japanese is so much harder of a language to learn, the progress you make is slower, and that in turn affects your motivation to continue to learn. So that's just something you should be aware of and kind of put into your plan. My fourth thing that I want to tell you about that I wish I'd known has to do kind of with the first thing a bit, and that is how Japanese relies a lot on grammar for nuance rather than having individual words. That's another aspect of the contextuality of Japanese. Whereas in English, for a different idea, we would probably use a different set of words. Whereas in Japanese, you just change the ending of the word. For example,そうです。そうですね。そうですよ。そうですよね. So those are kind of like 5 different words, but at the same time, it's one word, so, but with different grammatical endings, which are then used to have different meanings, like we would have different sets of words in English. So it's like you just add a little bit of a different ending to a word and it changes the meaning. Whereas when you would translate it, as you've seen how I put the subtitles when I just said each word or each phrase, you have to use a bunch of different words to translate it into English, whereas in Japanese it's just a base word with a different ending. And so the kind of words versus grammar difference is another thing that I didn't know a lot about before I started, and now I'm starting to learn more about it and getting more comfortable with it, but that's just something you should be aware of as well. And the fifth thing, and this is a big one, because there's people on YouTube that'll talk about like, don't try to use anime to learn Japanese, or yes, you should watch anime to try to learn Japanese. What I'm trying to say about this is that The thing I wish I'd known was that anime does not translate word for word. It's not a verbatim translation when you're reading the English subtitles. And when you're first starting out, that's about all you can do is watch Japanese with the subtitles in English. Now later on, once I get a little more advanced and I have more of a vocabulary, I'll try to watch Japanese with the Japanese subtitles and I'll get better immersion that way. But for now, just doing the English, the anime is set up to be subtitled in a way that is a good experience for someone watching Japanese who only speaks English in order to experience the story in a pleasant way. So it's a very good viewer experience. But for somebody who's trying to learn to speak the language, it's kind of misleading because it doesn't translate things word for word. And it's a little bit like the differences in Bible translations. So if you know anything about the Bible, there's a lot of different translations out there. And most of them come at how they translate the original Hebrew and Greek from a certain perspective of literalness to kind of like what the intended meaning that we think it is. And so you've almost got like this spectrum. At the one end, you've got a word for word literal translation of what the verse means, and then you've got the dynamic equivalent version. And so it's the same thing with anime. A lot of times I'll be watching with my wife and we'll both look at each other and be like, they didn't say that. They didn't say what the subtitle said. They said this thing instead. It's a good thing and a bad thing because it means as I'm watching, if I'm trying to learn specific phrases or words, I might not get the translation, like the exact word to word meaning the same. But it also means that I'm kind of like, while I'm trying to listen and see where the disconnect is between what they're saying and what's being written in English, it also kind of helps me engage more with the language that I'm doing. So it helps with it being more immersive because I'm listening for not only what are the words that I'm hearing, do I recognize, but also do they align with what I see in the subtitles? And it's almost like a scavenger hunt or something of language learning. Now the sixth thing that I wish I'd known about Japanese before I started learning was the differences between active and passive immersion. So if you've watched videos from folks like Matt versus Japan, then you'll know that he talks a lot about having constant immersion. And I definitely agree with him on that. I mean, obviously I should agree with him because he's taught himself Japanese and I'm still just a learner. I'm but the lowly Padawan, you know. One of the things that I want to distinguish, which I didn't know at first, was I thought that just listening to content and watching content in Japanese was immersion. Yes and no. There are different types of immersion. And so that's why I try to have a mix of active and passive immersion or learning, active and passive learning, while I'm working on my Japanese studies. And so just watching anime, especially if you're just using the English subtitles, is probably not as active as you think it is. It's probably going to be more of a passive immersion. It's not quite as passive as just listening to music in the background, you know, but it's not going to get you to fluency as much as you think it will because you're still just mostly reading the English and trying to catch up with the Japanese as it's being said. You're trying to kind of multitask with your brain as you're also, you know, paying attention to the story and watching the shots and all that stuff. So there are different types of immersion and you need to pick the right ones that are going to work for you and the right balance that will work for you in your lifestyle. Now, the last thing that I wish I'd known, which would have kind of helped me not be as intimidated by learning Japanese, is that you don't have to write the kanji in order to learn them. Now, this goes back to whatever your learning goals are. Some people definitely want to be able to handwrite in kanji. Maybe they want to do calligraphy. Maybe they want to be able to write, you know, extensively in Japanese, but that is kind of not my highest learning priority. I want to be able to speak it primarily, and secondarily, I want to be able to read it. And being able to write it is not as big of a deal to me. So I would kind of much rather be able to read and recognize the kanji and not necessarily know how to write it. I know that some people will say that kind of knocks me down on the fluency level if I ever get to that point, but I'm much more concerned about being able to speak and read. If I can't write stuff by hand, that's fine, because a lot of Japanese people don't even handwrite anymore once they get out of school. They're always typing on their phone or on a computer, and so they don't handwrite kanji very often anyway. So if that's how they do in Japan, I think I can get away with it too. Those are 7 things I wish I'd known. If you're already fairly good at Japanese, was this fun? Did you enjoy laughing at me? Tanoshii deshita ka? So hit the like button if you did enjoy laughing at all of my pain. And if you are further along than me, by all means, please correct my grammar or whatever in the comments, especially if you are a native speaker. Onegaishimasu. Now, if you want to learn Japanese alongside me in one of the ways that I'm doing it, then I highly recommend Ollie Richards' Japanese Uncovered online course. Ollie is a very famous YouTuber who speaks many languages, and he's even lived in Japan for several years to perfect his speaking skills. And so in the course, you dive straight into learning with stories rather than just rules or rote memorization. And I'm a happy customer. I'm still in the midst of the course, and so I think you will be a very happy customer as well. And so I've got a link for that in the description if you want to check that out. If you'd like to know more about how I'm personally studying Japanese in addition to using that course, then I've got a video about that right here.